A brief note before I begin the sermon, just a reminder that this is the second in a series of sermons which draw upon the Confession of Belhar, which is the most recently added faith statement in our denomination's Book of Confessions. I recently read an article by a Black Baptist minister entitled, "Why I'm Skeptical of New Christian Allies." His target seems to be more evangelical churches, but I don't think that progressive mainline churches are completely spared. Pastor Lavarin is encouraged that many Christians, including large numbers of those who have not previously been engaged in issues of race, are speaking up about police brutality in the wake of George Floyd's murder. But these feelings are tempered by worries that the change does not go deep enough. He writes, "Although numerous Christians have finally chosen to name racism, I am woefully skeptical of new allies who have rushed to protest without examining the ways in which their own theologies continue to nurture it. The failure to address theological racism will cause new allies to come to this moment, believing that the fight for justice is merely theologically adjacent to their brand of evangelism as the real work of ministry. For some, this is still just a societal issue and not a theological one." Now, as I mentioned earlier, this does not seem to target us Presbyterians. We've tended not to list evangelism very high on our litany of the real work of ministry. Of course, I'm not sure that justice is all that much higher on the list. For many Presbyterians, the real work of ministry is holding good worship, educating and nurturing children, and perhaps engaging in acts of charity in the community. So perhaps some of Pastor Lavarin's critiques apply to us as well. He continues, "Prior to this moment, new allies have preached a gospel of Jesus devoid of justice. They fail to make the theological connection that Jesus and justice are, in fact, mutually inclusive. To invoke Jesus and then to invoke justice is redundant. Every time we invoke the name of Jesus, we commit ourselves to the ministry of justice. Every time we invoke the name of Jesus, we declare the psalmist's decree that justice and righteousness are the foundations of God's throne. Every time we invoke the name of Jesus, we sum the messianic prophecy that the Spirit of the Lord was upon Jesus to preach the good news to the poor, to set the prisoners free from the Roman industrial complex, and to proclaim liberty to those who were oppressed. Every time we invoke the name of Jesus, we remember that Jesus was convicted of a crime he did not commit, received an unfair trial, and was sentenced to state-sanctioned lynching on a tree. We cannot divorce our theology from the ministry of justice, for to do so is to divorce ourselves from Jesus himself. The ministry of justice is the ministry of Jesus." But he saves his most pointed barb for the very end of the article. "Before your church decides to go out and protest, consider protesting your own theology that continues to intentionally and unintentionally do harm to black and brown bodies. Before taking a knee and holding a prayer vigil, consider this. There is no substantive difference between a racist bigot holding a Bible in front of a church and a Christian holding up a Black Lives Matter sign with no plans to parse out the practical implementation of the holy truth of justice. Ouch. Even if that arrow is not aimed at us, it still has a sting. Because very often we have viewed justice as a good thing, but not necessarily something central to our faith. It's one of those extras, like joining a prayer group or volunteering at welcome table. It's optional, an elective in the walk of faith curriculum. I wonder if the people addressed by the prophet Amos thought of justice as optional. Amos targets the wealthy of his day, but curiously, the failings of the rich reap problems for all of Israel. This was a time of great prosperity, but a prosperity not enjoyed by all. Amos condemns the wealthy for their abuse and exploitation of the poor, for their lives of extravagant luxury while others suffered. He also condemns their pious religiousness. These people went to church most every Sunday, and they put lots of money in the offering plate. They ensured that the sanctuary looked grand, that the music was glorious, that holidays had elaborate celebrations. And so they assumed that God would be there for them. But the prophet thinks otherwise. The day of the Lord, which apparently was seen as the promise that God would rescue them in a moment of crisis, was not at all what they imagined, said the prophet. It was darkness and gloom. And then, through the prophet, God speaks. I hate, I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals, I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Going to church every Sunday, holding wonderful and moving worship, making big pledges and faithfully keeping them. None of this matters, says the prophet, says God, without doing justice, without rightly ordered lives and a rightly ordered society. Jesus stands squarely in the footsteps of prophets like Amos. In Luke's gospel, when Jesus begins his public ministry, he reads from the prophet Isaiah and says that the words are fulfilled in him. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me and has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. This last one refers to the Jubilee year that was commanded by the Torah given by Moses. A year when all debts were to be forgiven, when those who had lost their land to poverty or debt or pretty much any other reason were to have it given back. Imagine suggesting that today. Jesus came proclaiming the kingdom, the day when the ways of God become the ways of the world. And over, he said that this day favored those seen as having little worth in our world: the poor, the outcast, the prisoner, the oppressed, the sinner, those looked down upon by good religious folk. But we somehow turn Jesus into a belief system that gets us into heaven or gives us a spiritual buzz. In last week's sermon, I mentioned that the Confession of Belhar was added to our denomination's Book of Confessions in 2016. I didn't say that this was on its second try. Belhar was first recommended in 2008 and sent to presbyteries for their vote in 2010. But it did not receive the required 2/3 supermajority, and so it failed. And I wonder if this was not, at least in part, because it moved justice too much to the center of our theology by saying this: we believe that God, in a world full of injustice and enmity, is in a special way the God of the destitute, the poor, and the wronged. That God calls the church to follow God in this, for God brings justice to the oppressed and gives bread to the hungry. That God frees the prisoner and restores sight to the blind. That God supports the downtrodden, protects the stranger, helps orphans and widows, and blocks the path of the ungodly. That God wishes to teach the church to do what is good and to seek the right. That the church must therefore stand by people in any form of suffering and need, which implies, among other things, that the church must witness against and strive against any form of injustice, so that justice may roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. That the church, as the possession of God, must stand where the Lord stands, namely against injustice and with the wronged. That in following Christ, the church must witness against all the powerful and privileged who selfishly seek their own interest and thus control and harm others. I wonder, what might church look like if this sat squarely at the center of what we understood church to be and to do? All praise and glory to the one who was anointed to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and proclaim the coming of God's Jubilee. Amen.